Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Today we have another installment of our External Tech Talk series. So we have Jen Luker here. This Tech Talk was kind of scheduled around International Women's Day. So hopefully you'll see a lot of purple around the room. So yeah, we brought in Jen Luker. She is working at Gremlin, they're doing some chaos engineering, which is pretty cool. I got to hear about that over lunch, and she's doing some front-end development there and incorporating a lot of accessibility in her talks, or in her work. And her talk will be covering accessibility, so hopefully if you guys have been tuning into previous tech talks and just talks in general, lightning talks, we've talked a lot about accessibility, so kind of the why and the what, but today she's going to give us some tips on the how. What can we do today in our code that will improve accessibility and make our code more available for everybody. So everybody welcome Jen Luker.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Women's Accessibility Day, International Women's Day, there we go. Awesome, okay, so accessibility beyond the basics. The first thing I want to cover is, I have to give the intro, but I want to give the intro in a little bit deeper of a fashion, something that you may or may not have heard in some of the other conversations. So what is a disability? When a person is denied access due to a technology barrier, the impairment to their ability did not occur because of their body's limitations. Rather, the defect occurred in their technology. Okay, so what this is essentially saying is just because someone has a disability doesn't mean that it's their disability that causes them problems when it comes to things like the web. It's the website. The fascinating thing about this is the concept of what accessibility is and whether it is a bug, a feature, what those problems are. And if you have a bug where someone cannot get through the purchase process or they can't fill out the form that is highly important to the work that you're doing, that's a bug. Like, you're going to hop right on that and you're going to fix it immediately and you're going to hope that you were the one that caught it and not a customer. But when someone with a disability can't get through that same form or that same purchase process, nobody cares. So is it really a feature? Or is it the exact same bug? So diversity of disabilities. You've probably often heard about these three: permanent, temporary, and situational. Permanent would be something like a permanent disability, someone who's blind, someone who's deaf, someone in a wheelchair, someone missing a limb. Okay, you also have temporary impairments, like someone with a broken arm, someone who's had their eyes dilated. You have someone with situational limitations, like the baby's asleep and I can't use my mouse hand. Or the MacBook mice, where they have the plug on the bottom, so you actually have to like shut it off and plug it in and then hope while it charges. But what we don't often talk about are these: age-related impairments, multiple disabilities, health conditions, changing abilities. So when we're talking about age-related impairments, we're not necessarily talking just about people that are elderly. The concept of we can't teach old dog new tricks. What if this person is 6? Multiple disabilities. We often talk again about someone who is blind or someone who is deaf, but we never really bring up the concept of what if they're blind and deaf? What if they are in a wheelchair and they're blind? What if they have ADHD and they're deaf? Most of the time, disabilities do not come with just one limitation. They are very often paired in 2s, 3s, 4s, groups. And oftentimes, the boundaries between those disabilities are vague. At this point, when they're talking about the autism spectrum, ADHD is on it. They have grouped a whole series of things into that autistic spectrum. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have one and not another. It's very much a scale. It's a set. It's a bit of this and a bit of that. Health conditions. So when we're talking about health conditions, what about a heart condition? My daughter has pulmonary valve stenosis. So she can run and jump and play like other kids until she can't. And she has to stop and she has to rest. And she cannot physically go any further while the other kids are still running because she cannot oxygenate her blood as fast as they can at that rate. It takes her 20 minutes and she's back running around like any other kid. But it's a health condition that changes how she interacts with the world, how much she can do, how far she can go, whether she can walk through the entire fair or has to take multiple breaks. Are there benches? Can she take a break? And then there's changing abilities. Not every disability is permanent. It's not like an on and off switch. It's not a binary selection. You can have good days and bad days. Today is a good day. I could walk on my own. Yesterday was a bad day. I could barely get out of bed. Tomorrow will be an average day, and I will go out in the world in a wheelchair. Just because you have a disability doesn't mean it's always impacting how you interact with the world. Just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you always use accessibility services. Sometimes the tinnitus is really loud today, and I need my subtitles and my transcripts. And tomorrow it's not so loud. I can hear those conversations just fine. This actually changes a lot about how we think about disability, because it's not just one item. It's just not an on and off switch. It's an adaptive scale that comes and goes, ebbs and flows, good days, bad days. Today I need it, tomorrow I don't. And what does that mean for people, especially in something like the healthcare industry? When are they most likely to look at it? On a bad day. When are they most likely going to have to handle it? Probably on a good day. So we did cover a little bit about the types of impairments. We had visual, auditory, motor, cognitive. We talked about autism and ADHD. We talked about being blind. But there's also things like color blindness. And color blindness we default know of as there being 3 different kinds. You have monochrome, where you can't see any color, but you see shades of black and white. And then you have the 2 others, which essentially are a red-green similarity and a blue-green similarity, which means every time we have red means stop and green means go, red means error, green means success. If you're not doubling up on either icons or text or something to indicate what that actually means, then you're hitting that colorblind issue. And if you're not changing the tone, having a light one and a dark one, the color's exactly the same. And the same thing with blue and green, though we most often don't pair those. However, if you have a run button and a save button, and run is green and save is blue, you're running into the same issue. Making sure those are succinct and clear as to what they mean beyond their color is going to be extremely important. Auditory. Again, this isn't just deaf. This is hard of hearing. This is tinnitus. This is, I'm in a really noisy room and I'm trying to show my friend a video and nobody can hear it, so the subtitles are able to get the joke across for me. This is, I'm in a noisy room. I have perfect hearing and I still can't hear you. Just because Disabilities exist doesn't change the fact that people without disabilities still use accessibility services. Motor. We mentioned before, missing a limb, or something as simple as not having fine motor control. They can use their limbs, they can touch, they can press, they can use a keyboard, but it's hard. Parkinson's, for instance. The tremors themselves make it extremely difficult to control what they're clicking, what they're pressing, especially when they're talking about touchscreen devices. Making buttons large makes it much easier to interact with that. Cognitive. Now this is an interesting one. Oftentimes we think of cognitive disabilities as a learning disability or a neurological disorder. But what about a child? What about someone who's very old and hasn't taken the time to learn the new technology? What about someone where English is a second language? If someone is speaking quickly, that might land in the auditory. But if they're physically unable to understand what's happening, that's going to be a problem. And on average, people understand up to a 3rd grade reading level, which means the content that we put on our pages need to match that level as closely as possible. That's someone who has English as a 2nd or 3rd or 4th language. That's usually a child, or someone who hasn't stayed up on technology and the standard naming conventions of things. Accessibility isn't just accessibility, it's also internationalization, globalization. So when it comes to actually moving on to the how, taking things into practice and taking these concepts of the way that they're sometimes contradicting each other. For instance, someone with ADHD needs colors to be softer. Someone with sensory overload issues need color contrast to be low. But the first thing we learn in accessibility is keep your color contrast high. So how do we handle the fact that accessibility can sometimes be conflicting? So for this one, make the right things easy and the wrong things hard to do. When it comes to practice, we will always do what's easier for us by default. It's the first thing we go to, things we're familiar with, things we know how to do. But if you put in place processes that make doing the easy thing the right thing, you're much more likely to make more accessible websites. So the first thing you need to do is start with you. Before you can change the world, before you can change your company, before you can change your team, before you can change your website, you have to start with you. Because the only person you can control is you. I did put these 2 items on. There is, in fact, a VS Code accessibility extension that allows you to, if you're using VS Code, lint your systems for a lot of accessibility issues. Night Owl is an IDE color theme that is also accessible specifically for people with color blindness. There are light and dark and bold themes. You'll see Night Owl light, bold, later. Okay, but it goes beyond this. Not only are you starting with you, but what you're saying to yourself is that from today forward, I am going to make sure that my code that I write is accessible. The websites I look at are accessible. I'm going to take those steps to learn more about it, to test it. And then I'm going to look at PRs that I'm provided. And I'm going to test those too. Because most of the time, when you're looking at a PR, and it's your PR and someone else is looking at it, I guess I should say, you take the feedback and you just fix it. So if the argument is, you forgot to put the ability for an alt tag to be here, you're just going to fix it. And with just that one small thing, You've made the web more accessible. You've made your websites more accessible. Accessibility doesn't have to be this big, scary, giant thing. It can be done in itty-bitty, teeny-tiny, bite-sized pieces with every single PR and every bit of code you write. When you touch something, test it, fix it. Build it into your definition of done. Build it into your estimations. Because in the end, this isn't just accessibility testing. This is testing. One of the first ways that I learned more about accessibility tools was with Lighthouse and Axe, Chrome, and Firefox extensions. And later on, I learned more about VisBug, which allows you to interact with the page and get more detailed information regarding accessibility problems. Okay, so I actually wanted to show you the Axe, Chrome, and Firefox plugins. After you install Axe, you end up with an extra tab in DevTools. And it allows you to go ahead and run your results through Axe. And it gives you this list of problems or concerns that it found. All right, 84 elements must have sufficient color contrast. And when you come down and look at that, it gives you a little bit more information, like impact serious. Well, that's kind of disconcerting. You know, and it gives you that description, and it explains what rules you're trying to cover. It shows you where the element is. You can even inspect the node to find it. It shows you the element source. It even tells you how to solve it. And oftentimes, it gives you multiple options. What's even cooler is at the top, you have a Learn More button, which takes you out to a place where you can learn what it is, what the success criteria is, gives you an example tool, potentially, depending on what it is, and gives you more detailed information about why it matters, what the rules mean, how they're searching for it, resources to find out more information about it. Like, this is a fantastic educational tool. It gives you the ability to really dig in and figure out why this is a problem and the different ways in which you can fix it. And with just a little bit of time, an extra 2 minutes, an extra 5 minutes, you could fix a problem. Maybe it's not a color contrast. Maybe it's a landmark. You need to wrap the main body of your content in a main landmark. It doesn't take very long, but it gives you a lot more information. Form elements must have labels. Did you know that if you wrap a form element in a label, that qualifies? You don't have to go with IDs. Headings must not be empty. Zooming and scaling must not be disabled. That's a one-liner for pretty much your whole web page. Pages must contain a level 1 heading. All page content must be contained in a landmark. It walks you through how to do each and every one of these. It's a beautiful tool. So once you've started with your own definition of done, and you've started learning a bit, and you've started testing these things and checking and adding those comments into PRs, you start including your team in these things. You start having these conversations about including that in the team definition of done. And you can also include those in things like demos. Look at how you can navigate through this. Isn't this much easier? Now, manual testing takes time. But there are ways that you can actually automate a lot of this. You can start with a linter. Now, I did put in ESLint plugin JSX A11Y, specifically because it's for React. But this is included in a lot of different linters. So for instance, if you're using the Airbnb linter, you've already got this. If you created your app with Create React App, you've already got this. You can add this linting process to webhooks so that it tests before you even push to GitHub. And Axe Core, which runs both Lighthouse in Chrome and the Axe Chrome and Firefox extensions, comes in its own open source library, which means that you can actually integrate it into your CI processes. In fact, when you go look at Axe Core, you'll notice that it will give you a list of ways that you can implement it. So when you click on Web Testing API, it will bring you up to examples, and suddenly I can't find it. Either way, it actually gives you a whole bunch of examples, ways that you can run it, how those rules work, what the localization looks like, and it does give you a list of code examples that you can look at. So if you're running Cypress, for instance, it will walk you through how to set it up in Cypress. If you're using Jest, it'll walk you through that. If you're using just snapshot testing, it shows you how those integrate as well. Documentation. And I'm not just talking about your own internal documentation, I'm also talking about external documentation. What you put on your open source repos, so people can learn how to use the tools that you have available, so that you can learn how to use the tools you have available when you've forgotten in 3 weeks how it works. Every time you put a code example on the web, you can be guaranteed that someone's going to copy it and paste it straight out of that fashion. They won't even change anything. So every time you make a code example accessible, you're spreading that accessibility through everything that's actually being copied and pasted. Anytime you create a Stack Overflow answer, every time you share an example with a coworker, just check it. Make sure you've included those accessibility requirements. I once knew a woman who just started out in her accessibility career, or her engineering career, and she didn't know that you could exclude alt tags on an image, because every time she saw an example, it was included, and she thought it was required. And that was because the things that she was looking at, the people she was working with and talking to, always included it. And she had a job interview at one point, and they said, you know, it's really cool seeing that you've included these accessibility features. And she's like, wait, what? What's accessibility? And it's just because the code examples she was working off of were accessible, and therefore she thought those were the defaults. And whenever you have to go back and use those code examples, they're available for you, not just as a copy and paste, but as a reminder as well. When you are using those code examples, especially on external open source versions, but even on your internal ones, 1 in 8 men, for instance, are in fact colorblind. Most engineering teams are majority men. So all of those examples not only should be colorblind as far as the code goes, but also the color contrast, how the highlighting works. Prism.js is a great one to go to. Prism React Renderer is something done by Formidable that essentially wraps Prism.js into a React component. And then Ally Syntax highlighting allows you to use that theme to make sure that the theme itself is accessible. So people with colorblind issues don't have issues reading the code, don't have issues with the highlighting. So I want to talk code for a minute. And they say use the platform, right? And the most common example I see is button versus div. And I've seen so many people roll their eyes and like, you can make a div accessible, it's fine. So I want to show you today how you make a div accessible. Button versus div. What's the big deal? Okay, this is in fact a button. It just opens and closes that div. And this is a div. It does the same thing. And if you look for the code in this, and I've included some, default app stuff, and added basically your button and your div. And this is the button, right? You on-click, you use a hook, you set your value to true or false. Simple toggle, right? I want to make this button accessible, and I'm going to make it look like a div, so that you can style it pretty much however you want. So when we start with a button, I will give you a hint. You want it to say type equals button. And the reason being is that if there's one button on the page, it is already assumed to be a submit. So hitting enter on that page is going to submit that button. If you have 17 of them, the first one is assumed to be submit. So if you need to submit a form, set that as type equals submit. Otherwise, you should have a type equals button. So it responds correctly and doesn't reload your page every time. So at this point, it's a little bit more accessible as far as button goes. All right, so we're going to now make this a div, okay? I should actually add that I'm using emotion because it's familiar. And if you are not a React user, I do have a version of this on Code Sandbox that's vanilla JavaScript. And it's a lot more code. Okay, so we're going to display block, because that's what a div does. And then we are going to set our background color to none. And we are going to set our border to none. Almost. Fine. We'll make it as transparent today. All right, this is it. You've got a div now. You can style it however way you want. When you click on it, it still opens and closes. When you hit tab, it goes to it. When you hit enter, it opens. When you hit space, it opens and closes. You can tab out of it. Keyboard accessibility handled. Okay, the fact that there's text inside the button means screen readers read, I am a button, button. All right, let's make a div into a button. So first things first, let's just start on some CSS. And I am totally going to cheat with this because there's a lot of CSS here. You need to set it as display inline block. Okay, text align center, that's obvious. Color, button text. Did you know that was a thing? So that sets it to the default button text, color. If you've changed the color of buttons in your global CSS, it will change that to match. All right, border radius 2, because it's so cute and so tiny. And just a little tiny bit of a rounded edge. Okay, background color. It's my default background color from the 2000s. Box sizing, border box. If you haven't added this to basically every element on your page, you have to add it here. And the reason being is for the border. Padding. 1 pick, 7 picks to make it match. I never would have guessed 7 picks. Really? So the border is a 1 pixel outset 767676 color. That is a really random version of gray. Okay, and here's the magic trick. If you don't add cursor equals pointer, there are several iOS devices that no matter what you do, still will not detect it as a button, and you still can't click on it. How many of you knew that? Not a one. But we're not done. It looks like a button. I hit tab, I hit tab. Hit enter, it reloads the page. Nothing happens, it doesn't even go to it. So we obviously need to add a few other things like tab index. And the reason we add tab index equals 0 is because then it allows the tabs to flow in line, as opposed to if you set it to 1, then it's always going to be the second element, no matter what you do. You could add 400 tabbable elements above it, and it'll still go to that one next. Okay, 0 allows it to flow as the code flows. So now we can tab to it. Ooh, spotlight search. But no opening of the div. So now we need to add the ability to detect enter and space. And again, I'm cheating. On click. And on key press. So we have the on click already. What we didn't have is the on key press. And what we don't have here is also the allowed keys. So I basically just made a lovely little array, add it outside my component because I don't need to instantiate that every single time. They're not changing. And they're going to be the same for every time we have this component. So we have the allowed keys, enter and space. And the only reason you can get that is by doing E and code. And we're making sure that one of those two things are selected. It's either enter or it's space. And once we've done that, we can then set the hide text. So we can now still not do anything because I didn't say it properly. And this, my friends, is why I cheated, because it's easier to get through these. And the one thing we also missed is the role equals button. Because again, no matter how many times you tell it there's an on-click, there are still devices out there that will not detect it as a button without role equals button. I'll just restart it. Of course not. All right, so. It works, I promise. So essentially what we're looking at is this is what you require in React where you have hooks. Oh, that's why I didn't include my hooks. I didn't need hooks, never mind. All right, so this is essentially what you require in order to set a div to look like a button. That's a bunch of CSS. And there's quite a few different div roles you have to add. You need to know those things exist. You need to know, just magically, that you need a cursor equals pointer, even though it looks like you already have it on the web. You need to know, just magically, that you're going to have an enter and a space key to function in order to navigate to it and open and close that div just like a button does. So if it were me, and the fact that I'm still having issues getting this to work, a button was so much easier. And at that point, it acts like a button, looks like a div. Style it any way you like now. And you get all the accessibility for free. Free. So that's what they mean by use semantic HTML. What we're missing, though, is everything else. Last I checked, there was no semantic HTML for a navigation. There was no semantic HTML for a multi-select dropdown. Forms look a little different sometimes. What about a toggle pill? Like, that's really common, or it was a few years ago, and it seems to be making a comeback, kind of like the 90s overalls thing. So what do you do then? What do you do when you cannot use semantic HTML? I'm going to give you a few resources. Okay, Reach UI, and these are in alphabetical order. Reach UI is one. So this was written essentially as a toolkit of accessible components that already have these things built for you. It's open source. You can take it as it is, or you can take it and style it and adjust it and fix it. But essentially, it's starting out from an accessibility standpoint. You also have ReactKit that does something very similar. It's a set of components. But what if you don't want to use someone else's components and you have your own and you want to make them accessible, or you just need to write your own for some reason? Wyaria actually has authoring practices. It's this like super secret hidden link that you can never ever find unless you know exactly the search that you have to run to find it. All right. So it's essentially this. And what they've given you is not only just a little bit of instruction of what this means, what the roles mean, but then they have design patterns and widgets where they teach you things like how to make a button accessible, what you need, what it should do. Essentially, this is the definition of done. This is your acceptance criteria for how this should work. And then when you're done, you get all the way down to the bottom, they often give you this information in a little bit more readable option. And then they give you code examples. So if we're looking at a list box, which is essentially a multi-select dropdown, they tell you how to do it. They give you those options. They also have multiple examples if you go through it. So the beauty of this is even if you don't necessarily know exactly what it is you need to know, you know where to find it. And even if these aren't exactly what you're looking for, it gets you close. And it gives you multiple versions that you can play with and look at and see if that's what you want. It gives you the ability to see how they did it. See the portions that are required for your component, and to try to implement those and bring those into what it is you're doing. So even if you don't get the option of starting with a pre-written accessible component, you at least have the tools to be able to go in and find the information to make yours accessible. So to go over this before I go digging even deeper, accessibility is more than screen readers and color contrast. We knew that. All right, but you didn't necessarily know how deep that rabbit hole went and how things can conflict with each other and how sometimes you just have to start with what you know. Tools to start testing accessibility today. That includes things like the Chrome Firefox plugin, the Axe core components that you can include into things such as Jest or Cypress, or about 17 other examples that they give you. Okay, automating ally testing for the future. And then where to find code examples. And this is basically my last slide, but I have more to say. When it comes to accessibility, when should you start accessibility? Oftentimes the answer that you will hear is in the design phase. But I have never stood up here and seen people who are just starting out with a brand new code base that's empty, waiting for design, with developers and designers that are fully knowledgeable in accessibility, ready to go. They're almost always dealing with an old code base that they want to make better. So when should you start thinking and working on accessibility? Today. You've got old code, we know. But what about new code? What about things you modify, things you touch today? You can start with little fixes, things you can put in there, small sprint fillers. 1-point stories. I'm just going to fix that color contrast. I'm just going to add that landmark. I'm just going to make sure that header is in the appropriate order or that it actually has text. I'm going to make sure that I include a row of button on my buttons or on my divs that are buttons because it's going to take a minute before I convert those over to buttons. Or maybe I'll see a few buttons that are divs that should be buttons, and I'll clean those up real fast and reduce a whole bunch of CSS in the process. Maybe I'll start with a reusable component. One small change fixes lots of things all over your website. The beauty of accessibility is that it's ever evolving and ever changing. You'll never reach perfect accessibility, and even if you did, you wouldn't stay there for long. Because just like developers and websites, we're always growing and we're always getting better. So as opposed to thinking of it as a new feature that you have to add, extra time you have to spend, think of it as part of the tests. Think of it as part of the definition of done. Think of it as a bug that prevents people from getting through your form. Think about the fact that one small change can have a huge impact. Maybe the change you make today is going to allow someone new to get the information that they needed tomorrow. Life-saving information. And it only took you a minute. And above all else, remember, be kind. For everyone you know is fighting JavaScript. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
What happened to Domino's?
What happened to Domino's? Oh. Okay, so Domino's is fascinating. Essentially what happened is that someone sued Domino's saying that a part of their selector form box was inaccessible. Domino's is not a government company. It's not it doesn't really have any reason to officially and legally fulfill requirements for accessibility, but they were sued for this. Now, the interesting thing about the laws are that we have two different sides of this law. We have reasonable accommodation, meaning that if we can make an accommodation, we should, and we have to. We don't have to give them the exact accommodation they want, but we do have to give them one, okay? The other side of that is that the accommodation is just too expensive and it would basically wreck our company. We don't have to do it. And that's meant to protect small businesses that are still building up to the point where they can support that. All right, it's not necessarily meant for really large companies that have that ability. However, in Domino's case, they attempted to say that their issue with their form fell under unreasonable accommodation, that it was just too expensive. And they lost. They lost. The reason this is important is because this opened up a whole can of worms. This means that not just government entities and companies acting or working on government-protected land like national parks, or companies that work with government contracts have to have legal accessible compliance. This allows pretty much every website to get sued. So, do you want 5 minutes to fix that bug now? Or do you want a $100 million lawsuit? Any other questions?
How do you address accessibility on something that isn't necessarily a front-end UI?
This is one of my favorite subjects right now. Say your customer service tool is not accessible to someone who is blind. Is it not accessible to someone who is blind because they've not hired any blind people that need to work on it? Or is it because they're using the fact that your tool is not accessible as a way to get around hiring blind people? What about your internal tools? What about a dev? If your internal tools are not accessible, you could potentially be giving your company an excuse to not hire someone with that disability, legally. If your educational tools internally, for instance, are not accessible, or your external open source documentation isn't, you're preventing people with disabilities from even learning the craft. I mean, we have pretty decent healthcare. We have good pay, we have flexibility, sometimes we can even work from home. I mean, who needs that more than us? And why are we keeping people from having those freedoms, from having those benefits? So when it comes to internal tools, it's much more reaching than just, yeah, we don't have anyone with that disability, so it's fine. Because maybe the fact that you don't is not circumstantial. Anyone else?
Okay, well, we will be hanging out down here for a little bit, so if you think of any questions, feel free to come down and talk to Jen. But let's give her another round of applause and thank her for coming today.